Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'd like to thank the organizers, Stockholm Environment Institute and CV, the Swedish Waterhouse, and SIANI and Focali and SLU. For me, you are the Swedish champions for landscape approach, and so thank you so much for organizing this seminar, but also the inspiring work that you are all involved in, and of course including the Forest Agency, so to not the least. I'd also like to thank Ingrid for sharing with us the sort of more national implementation of the agenda, the 2030 agenda, and I'm looking forward, Maria, to your presentation on what SIDA is working. So I'm going to be speaking more about what the Swedish government is working on in terms of the more international policy processes. And for someone who has been involved in negotiating those SDGs and also the Paris Agreement, it is of course very rewarding to see the action that these international commitments is actually generating. And today the focus is on the landscape level, and I have a confession to make. I have worked quite a bit before I joined the ministry at the landscape level, so for me this is very dear to my heart. I believe that this is a scale where people work and live, and so therefore it is really a scale and a level which really engage people in a meaningful way. But it is also, just as Louise said, it's an interesting scale because of the different interests that sort of comes together at the landscape, and therefore it is finding solutions at this level really can make a difference. So at the moment, I'm really floating very much on the international level, but I think it is interesting to see how this translates on the different levels, just as Louise mentioned in her introduction. So at the government, we don't have any specific international landscape policy or strategy. We have many strategies in the government, or developing many strategies, but not on the landscape level, not so far. And if you ask me, I don't think we should have one. And for me, I'm sure you all know Peter Holmgren, or at least have heard of him. He's the director for the Center of International Forestry Research, and his words sort of rings with me, and it's really that the landscape approach should not be institutionalized. It's an approach, it's a working method, it's more a way of thinking, and I think that's sort of how you should merely approach perhaps the landscape approach. But let me give you some examples of how the landscape approach come to play in international policy processes. So, for instance, in the climate negotiations, if you were to search for landscape in the Paris Agreement, you would find nothing. Does that then mean that the landscape approach does not apply or is applicable to the implementation of the Paris Agreement? Well, for me, the answer is very clear. It's not. It's of course extremely relevant for the Paris Agreement. And if you start to look more deeply into the text of the Paris Agreement, for instance, in Article 5, which deals with forest, then you will have a specific mention of REDD+. It will also be the approach of joint mitigation and adaptation, as well as non-carbon benefits. And these are all approaches that are widely considered as landscape approaches. But you will not sort of find landscape per se in the text. And in Article 7, dealing with adaptation, there is a specific call for building the resilience of socioeconomic and ecological systems, including through economic diversification and sustainable management of natural resources. And for me, again, this is clearly manifesting a landscape approach. But there is, of course, still early days when it comes to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And just as Ingrid was mentioning, it will be extremely important to have, as well for the SDGs, how we're going to follow up and monitor and report and verifying climate mitigation. And this will be, I would say, maybe not only because I'm involved in the land use sector and that's what I'm part of negotiating in the Paris, in the follow-up to the Paris Agreement, but the land use sector is so important, not only because many countries have mentioned this in their INDCs, but because the sector itself it's both you know, a source and a sink for greenhouse gas emission, but there is also lots of difficulties and to really how to measure all of this. And that will be a key. And I think that's also a key to the SDG follow-up. How are we going to measure the progress in the land use sector? And how are we going to find the sort of right indicators and methods for this? And from a Swedish context, when it comes to, you know, the follow-up for the Paris Agreement, since we are a very forested landscape throughout Sweden, it's the forest that will be of extremely important for us to achieve our climate objectives. And here, of course, from our ministry, we are very much seeing the opportunities also that lies in this, the opportunities of using forest as a substitution for fossil fuel. And so there are, you know, a lot of things happening in Sweden, but also in many countries now, on how to sort of follow up with the Paris Agreement. And yesterday I attended the initiation of the agroforestry network, and I think this is also will with Paris be a lot of opportunities in this regard, as well as, of course, continuation of REDD+ in those countries, in those developing countries that have tropical forests where that applies. But the Paris Agreement and the climate negotiations are so much more than just the negotiations. And similarly, that we heard from Ingrid about the business communities and the stakeholders being involved. We also see this in the climate agenda. The climate action agenda is a way of energizing the climate debate and bringing so many people together around the Paris Agreement and its agenda. And in Paris last year, Sweden joined 2 initiatives that I think are highly relevant for the discussions that we have today at the landscape level. And one of them is the New York Forest Declaration, which highlights forest restoration. And I think there is a huge potential for forest restoration, both for climate, but also for SDGs and the implementation of the SDGs. Another initiative that we joined was the 4 per 1,000. It's an initiative to for food security and climate. And yet again, that's another example where you see how both the climate agenda and the SDGs can go hand in hand. And it's about to increase the soil carbon stock, primarily on agricultural land. I'm also involved with global forest policy discussion within the UN. It's the Food and Agriculture Organization, but also the UN Forum of Forest. And much of those discussions for many years have been devoted to deforestation. As you are fully aware, even though the deforestation rate has somewhat slowed down, it is still very much alarming. And within the international forest community, we are fully aware that many of the major threats to forest often lie outside the forest sector. But we haven't been really able to effectively communicate and reach out to other sectors. Here I actually think that the SDGs can be helpful in this regard, helping bridging this. And even at FAO this summer, there was the Global Committee on Forest, COFO, it's a forestry committee under FAO. One of FAO's flagship publication, which is the State of the World's Forest, highlighted clearly these cross-sector linkages and that we need those cross-sectoral approaches. But there has been difficulties to address that at the landscape level in these global processes, both within FAO and at the UNFF. Because as long as you talk about cross-sectoral approaches when it's global or regional or national, it's okay. But when it comes down to at the landscape level, it is often there are some countries at least that have problem with this because they think it's interfering with their national sovereignty. But I see a clear difference now with the SDGs, that there is a much more openness from the international forest community to somehow step out a little bit from its comfort zone and start addressing these more cross-sectoral approaches and being more engaged in how can forests contribute to these different SDGs. As you are fully aware, it's SDG 15 and particularly maybe 15.2 that are dealing with deforestation and sustainable forest management. But increasingly we see also that there is a much greater recognition of how forests can come into play, or forest landscape can come into play with many of the SDGs. And I think also this is happening more at the national level. Some of you have been very much involved in the work of developing for the first time a national forest program in Sweden. And even here we see a lot of greater recognition of the SDGs and being part of a broader agenda. And I think this can also translate into more action, also looking at the landscape level and involving new stakeholders that perhaps have not been involved so much in forest discussions. And so we are sort of the SDGs and the Paris, all of this has sort of somehow translated also into how we're thinking more nationally as well. And that I think there is a growing awareness of that it is multifunctional landscape that will be able to deliver on the SDGs, but also on our climate commitments. And I'm convinced that the solution can be found in many places, and we must work in many different levels. It's within the work of the UN, and other international organizations, but it's also the work that we're doing nationally, but also on different platforms, nationally, but also regionally, locally, and in our everyday landscape, how we sort of approach and go about and thinking. And I think that's kind of trying to see how the landscape approach can help us to find the interconnection. It is to really have that to sink in will be what can actually deliver sustainable development. So thank you.